Hello, I'm Darren Steele with shadowsofpindus.com. I want to talk about tabletop culture today and an aspect of it that if you influence can help to bring the joy and lightness back into your gaming. Sometimes Dungeons and Dragons just isn't as easy as it ought to be. Feels like it takes a lot of work, feels like it's difficult, feels like it's frustrating. If this is how you feel, you might have culture issues. Culture, as defined by Dr. Brené Brown, is how we do things around here. It's an accumulation of assumptions and habits and thought patterns that a group of people have and operate under. Only by identifying them can we begin to change them. And if you're looking to get more joy and lightness into your game, we want to look at the aspect of tabletop culture that is vulnerability. Vulnerability is going to be the secret ingredient that helps you get more often the joy and ease and laughter you're looking for. So vulnerability is the opposite of invulnerability. Vulnerability is being able to be hurt. Shame and vulnerability researcher Dr. Brené Brown, she talks about it being emotional exposure, risk, and unpredictability. I think the tabletop role-playing games involves all of these. But let's go back in time. Let's talk about childhood role-playing. Children are incredibly vulnerable. They depend on adults for everything. They are always at risk of starvation if somebody doesn't put food in front of them. They're not strong. They can't defend themselves. And they are exposed. Everybody around them is much stronger than them and feels entitled to boss them around. And yet, children are good at vulnerability, oftentimes. Children are comfortable in that situation. It doesn't freak them out. Despite being vulnerable, they're open. Their imaginations, they lay out for the world, and they're not afraid that somebody in the world is going to tell them that their imagination is stupid. They're not so afraid of shame, and you can see it in the way that they role play. And not even games, playing Cops and Robbers or House or Jurassic Park. They just are absolutely invested in their imaginations, and they play easily and are full of fun. They take their play seriously and enjoy every minute of it. And that level of commitment and wonder and freedom would be a pretty cool ingredient to be able to reproduce at the gaming table. I started role-play gaming when I was very, very young. People have ridiculous stories about how young they are. Average young. I started grade 6-ish with a friend that I met at library camp. If you started around this age, I think you're going to have a story similar to mine. We played Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 2nd edition. Kind of. That was the rule book we had, but all we ever got out of it, I think, were pictures, were inspiration. I played a paladin, he played a game master. It was the two of us. We didn't have polyhedral dice. We had D6s from a Yahtzee set maybe, and everything in the game was determined by a roll of a single D6. A 6 was always a success, a 1 was always a failure, and, well, things between were up to the game master. We had no sense of rules, and we had no sense of plausibility in the world. We only had a love of each other's imaginations and a delight to engage in role-playing. There was a moment when, in the middle of a quest that had to do with something entirely different, I decided that finding a phoenix was the thing that I had to do. And so I went into the thicket out back of the tiny hick town my character was in, and I went looking for one. And I was asked to roll a d6, and I rolled a 6, and suddenly, poof, in this tiny little town, there was a phoenix in the backwoods. And then I decided I wanted to tame it. And I rolled a d6, and I rolled a 1, and had to flee to avoid being immolated. That's a moment that's so embedded in my memory, and there's so much from that campaign that I treasure still to this day. Not because the rules were right, but because we had a culture of celebrating each other's imagination, of being able to be very vulnerable, very exposed to each other, and support each other in that. Unfortunately, that hasn't been my experience with gaming always. Gaming is vulnerable. There's a reason why people are often reticent at the gaming table. Public speaking is often held up as being the biggest fear that Americans have, and roleplay gaming is improvisational public speaking. And people might dismiss social fears and anxieties as being something somehow less than actual physical threats, but to our brains, they're not. They're no less. They're formed in this base instinct to survive from a time when being outcast from a community absolutely was death. Social anxieties and fears and vulnerabilities are every bit as real and intense as physical ones. And if you have any doubt that what happens around a game table can be hurtful, that opening up to a group of people isn't vulnerable, then follow a link that I'm going to put in the description to a blog post by a Canadian gamer named Mysty Vander talking about an awful experience that she had at a convention playing Pathfinder and the cruelty she suffered there. I think you'll be convinced that gaming can absolutely be a very vulnerable experience. And gaming without vulnerability is a pretty boring and even frustrating experience. It takes being able to jump into the unexpected to have the sort of free, fun improvisation that we're looking for in our games. If people don't want to be exposed, they don't make very creative choices. If they don't want risk, they just don't speak up. And if they're trying to limit unpredictability, they'll do things like make perfectly optimized characters and take long rests after every single combat. If your tabletop culture is one where people feel that they will be shamed for some of their choices, even choices that are like legitimately bad choices from a gameplay perspective, if people are afraid of that, they'll just make a lot less interesting choices. The game is going to be a lot duller.
There's good news and there's bad news. The good news is you can absolutely get vulnerability into your table and shift the culture. The bad news is it takes a while. There's no snapping your fingers and overnight fixes. The good news is that you can start right away and chip away at it little by little. And the other good news is that Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop role-playing games in the hands of a caring game master are like purpose-made tools for the creation of a safe space for the exploration of comfort with vulnerability. In the next video, I'm going to show you what tools already exist inside your game that you can leverage as vulnerability training wheels for yourself and your players to get more joy and ease back into your game.